At family dinner, my sister mocked my daughter's hearing aid. My dad said, "It's just a joke, Stella. Lighten up." I stayed quiet while Emma shrank in her seat. But my husband stood up. Without a word, he showed them the door. He didn't argue or yell. He simply opened the heavy oak portal and waited. When they discovered the next morning what that silence truly cost, the screaming started. My father's wine glass remained half full, a dark stain on the white linen. The hum of the stove vent was the only thing filling the sudden void. Rachel had laughed so hard she forgot to breathe, her finger still pointed at Emma's ear. My mother's smile was a frozen mask of polite discomfort. Mark didn't blink as he held the brass handle. He looked at them with a cold, terrifying neutrality. My family moved like shadows, confused and insulted, shuffling into the night air. The lock clicked with a finality that made the floorboards vibrate. I sat at the head of the table, my hands folded like a prayer. Emma's small fingers brushed the plastic casing behind her ear. She whispered a question I couldn't answer, her eyes glossy and wide. Mark returned and pulled her into his lap without saying anything. The house felt massive and hollow. I looked at the expensive roast I had spent 6 hours preparing. It was cold now. I realized then that I had been feeding people who only wanted to bite me. The silence was a choice, a tactical retreat into the digital shadows of my office. I opened my laptop and felt the blue light wash over my tired face. Rows of numbers blinked back at me, thousands of dollars flowing out like a steady pulse. I had spent years being the secret foundation of their lives. I paid the tuition for Rachel's children. I covered my father's club fees. I was the invisible hand of their comfort. I stared at the cancel button. Each click was a heartbeat. I felt the physical weight of my family's entitlement lifting off my shoulders. I processed the termination of Rachel's private school payments first. Then, I moved to my father's secondary medical insurance. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt precise. I was an engineer dismantling a faulty structure before it collapsed on my child. The bank portal processed each request with a soft, mechanical chime. By dawn, their lifestyle would be a memory. I closed the screen. The sun rose over a quiet street, but my phone was a live wire. It vibrated against the granite counter until it slid toward the edge. I didn't pick it up. Mark poured the coffee, his eyes meeting mine in the morning light. We watched through the window as the school bus pulled up. Emma climbed the steps with her head held high, her device glinting in the sun. She didn't look back. The first frantic voicemail from Rachel finally began to play. Rachel's voice was a jagged blade coming through the speaker. She wasn't asking for an apology. She was demanding a wire transfer. The private academy had stopped her children at the gate because the tuition was 3 months overdue. I let her talk until her breath hitched. I didn't remind her of the dinner or the jokes. I just told her I wasn't the bank anymore. The silence that followed was heavy. She actually thought I was joking. I stood in my kitchen, staring at a stack of unpaid bills I'd pulled from my father's desk weeks ago. He called next. His tone forced and jovial. He mentioned the country club and a clerical error with his membership card. He didn't know I could see his account balances. He didn't know I'd seen the charges for the luxury car he couldn't afford. I told him to ask Rachel for a loan. He hung up immediately. The pressure in the house began to shift. Mark watched me from the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He knew the fallout was only beginning. My brother's name flashed on the screen, a new notification from the bank. His business loan was tied to my personal collateral. If I pulled back, he would lose the warehouse by Friday. I felt a momentary pang of guilt, then remembered Emma's face. I tapped the screen and confirmed. I drove to the office to escape the noise. The medical technology lab was sterile and bright, a sharp contrast to my family's messy lives. My assistant handed me a folder of patent royalties. The numbers were staggering, far more than my family ever guessed. They thought I was a mid-level manager with a modest salary. I liked the mask. It kept them from seeing the leverage I held. Then I saw a familiar car in the lot. My mother was waiting by the fountain. She looked older, her face lined with a sudden, sharp panic. She didn't lead with anger like the others. She tried the old way. She spoke of family loyalty and the importance of appearances. She asked if I was truly willing to let my sister's children suffer for a few words at dinner. I looked at her polished shoes and felt nothing. She hadn't defended Emma. She had only defended her seat. I told her the truth about the payments. I detailed every dollar I had funneled into their pockets, while they treated me like a secondary character. Her eyes went wide when she realized the scale of the debt they now faced. She wasn't losing a daughter. She was losing a benefactor. I turned to walk inside, leaving her standing in the heat. She shouted my name, but it sounded like a ghost. I didn't turn back once. Inside the lab, I pulled up the final document. It was a transfer of the remaining family trust to a foundation for hearing accessibility. There would be no more secret bailouts or hidden grace periods. My family would have to learn the actual cost of their lifestyle. I felt a strange sense of peace as I clicked the final authorization. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Rachel. She was already at my house. I drove home with my heart hammering against my ribs. Rachel's car was parked crookedly across our driveway, like a discarded toy. She was pacing the porch, her designer bag swinging wildly with every frantic step. I stayed in the car for a moment to breathe. The suburban quiet felt fragile and thin. Mark was already standing by the front door, a silent sentinel. He didn't look angry. He looked ready. I finally stepped out into the humid air. Rachel didn't wait for me to reach the stairs. She started screaming about the school's registrar and the public humiliation of her children. Her face was flushed a deep, ugly purple. She called me a monster for using her kids as pawns. I walked past her without blinking. My keys jangled in my shaking hand. I told her the school wasn't the problem. Her bank account was the problem. She lunged for my arm, but Mark stepped between us. We moved into the foyer, the air conditioning humming a low, indifferent tune. Rachel followed, her voice dropping to a desperate hiss. She tried to bargain, promising she would apologize to Emma properly. She even offered to take us to dinner, as if a steak could fix a decade of condescension. I sat on the bench and unlaced my shoes. I asked her how it felt to finally be the one asking for a favor. Her eyes darted around. The turn came when my brother, David, arrived through the back door. He looked smaller than I remembered, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with sweat. He didn't yell at me. He just sat at the kitchen table and cried. He confessed that the warehouse was already being audited. He had been using the loan money for personal debts, assuming I would always cover the gap. Rachel froze. She hadn't known David was drowning too. They were all linked. I realized then that they were a house of cards. One tug on the thread had pulled the entire family into the dirt. David looked up, begging for just one more month of grace. I looked at the kitchen table where Emma had cried 48 hours ago. I told them both that the trust was gone. Literally. I showed them the confirmation on my phone. The funds were already in the foundation's coffers. There was no going back. Rachel's desperation turned back into a sharp, venomous rage. She accused me of being cold and calculating from the start. She said, I had set them up to fail. I reminded her that I didn't make her laugh at my daughter. I didn't make her spend money she didn't earn. She looked at the family photos on the wall, as if they were evidence of a crime. Then she said something that made the room turn ice cold. She whispered that our father had a secret account I didn't know about. My hand tightened on my phone. She claimed he had been hiding money from me for years while taking my help. It was a classic move, a final attempt to shatter my resolve with a new betrayal. I looked at Mark, and he nodded toward the office. If she was telling the truth, the game was much deeper than I had imagined. Someone was watching us. I retreated to my office and locked the door behind me. My father's secret account was a ghost I had to hunt. If Rachel was right, he hadn't just been a leech. He had been a thief. I pulled up his social security number and ran a deep forensic sweep through the medical networks I managed. My pulse thrummed in my fingertips. I bypassed 3 layers of security before a hidden offshore entity appeared on my glowing screen. The numbers didn't lie. While I paid for his blood pressure medication and his country club dues, he was funneling money into an estate in the Cayman Islands. He had nearly $2 million tucked away in a corporate shell. My stomach turned. He had watched me work 60-hour weeks to support them, while he sat on a literal fortune. It wasn't just entitlement anymore. It was a calculated heist of my youth and my kindness. I heard a heavy thud against my office door. My father was here now. His voice muffled but sharp with demand. He wasn't begging like David or screaming like Rachel. He sounded like a man who believed he still held the high ground. I looked at the offshore balance and felt a cold, sharp laughter bubble up. I hit the print button. The machine began to hum, spitting out the physical evidence of his long, silent betrayal. I opened the door and handed him the warm paper. He took it, his eyes scanning the lines with practiced indifference, until he hit the bottom row. His face went gray, the color of wet ash. He looked at me, then at Rachel, who was watching from the hallway with a strange, predatory hope. He realized I didn't just know his secret. I had the power to flag it for the Internal Revenue Service. The power balance in the foyer shifted instantly. He tried to claim the money was a safety net for all of us. I laughed then, a sound that felt like breaking glass. I asked him if the safety net included Emma's hearing aid or her dignity. He went silent, his shoulders sagging for the first time in my life. He looked like a fragile old man. But I knew better. He was just a caught fox in a trap. Rachel saw his weakness and moved in. She demanded he pay her children's tuition, since I had cut her off. They began to argue right there in my home. 2 vultures fighting over a dying animal. They didn't even notice me walking toward the kitchen. They had forgotten I was even in the room. I was just the engine that had stopped running. Mark stood by the window, watching the street with a frown. He pointed toward the driveway. A black sedan had pulled up behind Rachel's car. And 2 men in dark suits were getting out. They weren't family, and they weren't friends. They looked like the kind of men who came to collect things that were no longer yours. My father saw them through the glass, and his breath hitched in a terrifying way. He stepped back from the door, his eyes wide. They were looking for him. The men approached the porch with a mechanical, synchronized rhythm. My father scrambled toward the kitchen, his polished loafers sliding on the hardwood floor. He looked at me with a desperate, animal pleading that made my skin crawl. He wasn't the patriarch anymore. He was a fugitive in a silk tie. Rachel backed into the coat rack, her face pale as a sheet. The doorbell rang once, a sharp chime that echoed through the hollow hallway. I didn't move. Mark opened the door before I could find my voice. The taller man held up a gold badge that glinted in the late afternoon sun. They weren't from the tax office. They were federal investigators tracking the offshore shell company I had just uncovered. My father had been moving more than just his own money. He had been laundering funds for a defunct medical supplier. The room felt suddenly small. I felt the heat of the sunset on my neck. Rachel started babbling about her innocence before they even stepped inside. She tried to distance herself from the man who had paid for her lifestyle for decades. The investigators ignored her, their eyes locked on my father. He stood by the island, trembling so hard the granite seemed to vibrate. I realized then that my financial cutoff was the least of his problems. I had accidentally pulled the pin on a much larger grenade. The silence was absolute. One investigator turned to me and asked for my name. I told him I was the one who managed the primary medical accounts. I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes. He knew my firm. He knew my reputation for precision and transparency. He asked if I had noticed any irregularities in the domestic billing cycles. I looked at my father, who was shaking his head. I told the truth. I handed over the forensic printout. The power shift was violent and final. My father's legs gave out, and he slumped into a kitchen chair. Rachel began to weep, but it was the sound of a woman mourning her own social standing. She realized her name would be dragged through the mud alongside his. David watched from the corner, his eyes vacant and dead. They were all losing everything at once. I felt a cold, sharp relief. The truth was out. The investigators escorted my father toward the black sedan. I watched through the glass as the man who had mocked my daughter was handled like common cargo. He didn't look back at us. He just stared at the ground, as if searching for a way to vanish into the dirt. Rachel tried to follow them, shouting about her children's reputation. Mark closed the door on her voice, locking it for the second time that day. We stood in the foyer, the house finally quiet. I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. I walked back to my office to check on Emma. She was sitting on the floor, calmly assembling a Lego set with her hearing aid perfectly in place. She looked up and smiled, unaware of the wreckage in the other room. Then I saw a new notification on my laptop screen. It was an incoming transfer from a source I didn't recognize. The amount was exactly what I had donated that morning. Someone was sending it back. I stared at the screen as the numbers refreshed with a cruel precision. The incoming transfer was massive, a perfect mirror of my earlier donation. It wasn't a refund from the foundation I had supported. It was a triggered reversal from a dormant trust my grandmother had established decades ago. I realized with a jolt that I hadn't just moved money. I had unlocked a failsafe. My family's greed had been the only thing keeping this specific vault sealed. Now, I was the sole trustee. Rachel pounded on the office door, her voice cracking with a new, sharper desperation. She had seen the notification on her phone, through the family's linked banking portal, before I could sever the digital ties. She didn't care about our father being led away in handcuffs. She only saw the sudden surge in my personal liquidity. She begged me to listen, her words tumbling over each other like falling stones. She promised to change her lifestyle completely. I looked at the accept prompt and felt a cold, metallic surge of absolute power. I opened the door and found her huddled on the floor. Her mascara had left dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back. I told her the money was already being redirected to a secondary, ironclad account. She wouldn't see a single penny of the interest or the principal. The shock on her face was almost satisfying. She had spent her entire life assuming my silence was weakness. Now, she was finally meeting the architect. David walked into the hallway, his face a mask of hollow defeat. He held his phone out like a white flag. His creditors were already calling about the warehouse collateral. He asked if I could at least save the family home from the federal sweep. I looked at him and saw the little boy who used to hide my toys. He was still hiding, even now. I told him the house was already flagged as part of the investigation. It was gone. The air in the house grew thick with the smell of rain and old wood. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother sitting in the dark. She was holding a photo of Emma from last year. She didn't look up when I entered. She whispered that she had always known about the offshore account. She had stayed quiet to keep the peace. I realized then that her silence was the real betrayal. She had traded my child's dignity for a comfortable, quiet lie. I took the photo from her hand and placed it face down on the granite. I told her that we were moving out by the end of the week. This house was tainted by the secrets they had built into the walls. She started to cry, a soft, pathetic sound that didn't move me. I felt like I was watching a movie in a language I no longer spoke. Mark appeared at my side, his hand steady on my shoulder. He had been my strength when I was too quiet to speak for myself. We were leaving. The mid-scene turn arrived when a new vehicle pulled into our driveway. It wasn't the police or another family member. It was a courier carrying a thick, yellow envelope addressed only to me. I stepped onto the porch and signed the digital pad. Inside were the original deeds to the family's summer properties. They weren't in my father's name at all. They had been signed over to me by my grandmother before she died. I had been the owner for years. I turned to Rachel, who was watching from the doorway with narrowed, suspicious eyes. I held up the deeds and told her exactly where she was going to live. It was a small, remote cabin 3 states away. It was the only property not included in the federal seizure. She could stay there for free, but there would be no staff and no luxury. It was a cage made of cedar in isolation. Her jaw dropped in silent, horrified disbelief. The realization hit them all at once. I wasn't just cutting them off financially. I was dictating the physical terms of their new, smaller lives. I felt a strange, cold peace as I walked back inside to pack Emma's things. My daughter was the only person who mattered in this wreck. I promised her a new house with a garden, and no secrets. She hugged me tightly, her hearing aid clicking against my collarbone. It was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. As I closed the final suitcase, I noticed a small, handwritten note tucked into the envelope. It was my grandmother's elegant script, dated 20 years ago. It said that the quietest heart often carries the heaviest sword. I realized she had seen this moment coming before I was even an adult, and she had built the safeguards to ensure I would survive it. She had armed me for a war I didn't know I was fighting. I tucked the note into my pocket. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The message on the screen was a single line of text. It contained a digital address and a sequence of numbers that looked like a decryption key. I recognized the format from my time in high-level medical data security. It was a link to a secure private server. My father's laundering operation was deeper than the feds even suspected. I stared at the blinking cursor, feeling the cold weight of the decision. If I opened this, I became a permanent part of the conspiracy. Rachel burst into the room again, ignoring the luggage blocking her path. She saw the screen, and her eyes widened with a familiar, greedy hunger. She didn't understand the danger, only the potential for another payout. I closed the laptop lid with a sharp, plastic snap. I told her to get out before I called the investigators back to the house. She sneered at me, her face a mask of bitter resentment. She claimed I was just as corrupt as our father now. I ignored her and focused on the physical task of leaving the wreckage. Mark carried the last of our boxes out to the SUV. The driveway was crowded with the cars of people who no longer mattered to me. I looked back at the house, seeing the shadows lengthening across the front porch. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene of the spirit. I felt the thin paper note from my grandmother crinkling in my pocket, its message a silent anchor. She had known the price of this freedom. The mid-scene turn arrived when a second black sedan pulled up behind our car. A woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out and held up a badge. She wasn't with the federal team that took my father. She was from the state's licensing board for medical technology firms. Someone had filed a formal complaint against my professional ethics. My heart skipped a beat. Rachel smiled from the porch, her arms crossed over her chest. She had made the call while I was packing. The investigator asked to see my personal laptop, and the company issued hard drives. I felt the sweat bead on my upper lip as I looked at the bag containing the decryption key. If they found that link, my career was over regardless of my innocence. I looked at Mark, and he stepped closer, his jaw set in a hard line. He asked if they had a warrant for a private vehicle search. The woman didn't flinch. She said she had probable cause based on the family's arrest. I realized then that Rachel was willing to burn the entire world down. She didn't want the money anymore. She wanted me to suffer as much as she was. I reached into the bag and gripped the laptop. I had to decide between protecting my reputation and exposing the final layer of my father's rot. The investigator waited, her pen hovering over a clipboard. I looked at Emma sitting in the back seat. My daughter was watching me with those wide, trusting eyes. I handed the laptop over without saying a single word to my sister. I told the investigator exactly where to find the encrypted partition and the remote server link. I explained that I had just discovered it and was preparing to report the breach. Rachel's smile vanished instantly. She hadn't expected me to hand over the evidence so freely. She thought I would hide it like the rest of them. She didn't know that my integrity wasn't for sale. The investigator's expression softened as she reviewed the initial logs on the screen. She saw the timestamps showing I had only just accessed the files minutes ago. My quick transparency had saved me from being labeled an accomplice. She thanked me for the cooperation and told me to stay within the state. I nodded, feeling the air return to my lungs. I looked at the porch. Rachel was gone, likely fleeing into the house to hide her own digital tracks. Mark started the engine and the vibration felt like a release of tension. We began to pull out of the driveway, leaving the sirens and the screaming behind. I didn't look back at the windows or the garden I had planted. I looked forward at the open road and the darkening horizon. We were going to a hotel tonight and a new life tomorrow. I felt the heavy sword my grandmother mentioned finally resting at my side. The war was over. As we reached the end of the block, my phone buzzed one last time. It wasn't a text or a call from the family. It was a notification from the bank regarding the trust I had established. The Foundation for Hearing Accessibility had received the funds and sent a message of gratitude. They mentioned that a young girl had already been scheduled for her first fitting because of the gift. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. It was finally quiet. We drove for hours in silence before finally stopping. The hotel room was sterile, smelling of lemon bleach and distant traffic. Emma slept soundly in the corner bed, her hearing aid resting on a velvet cloth like a crown. I sat by the window and watched the rain streak against the glass. The city lights blurred into soft, glowing orbs. Mark was downstairs checking our security protocols one last time. I felt the weight of the grandmother's note in my pocket. My phone remained silent. I finally let out a breath I had held for years. Morning brought a crisp, cold light that felt like a fresh start. We drove to a small office in the heart of the city. I had a meeting with a specialized trust attorney to finalize the separation. My family was already sending frantic emails through their lawyers. They wanted to negotiate the cabin's terms. I didn't even open the messages. I had spent my life negotiating with leeches. Today, I was simply signing the papers to end the blood supply. The lawyer nodded with approval. The primary obstacle appeared in the form of my mother, waiting in the lobby. She didn't have her pearls or her polished smile today. She looked like a woman who had finally realized the floor was gone. She didn't ask for money this time. She asked for my forgiveness so she could see Emma. I looked at her and saw the decades of calculated silence. I told her that forgiveness was earned through years of actions, Not a single moment of desperation. She stood there, frozen, as the elevator doors slid shut. The power balance shifted when the lawyer handed me a final, sealed file. It contained the true records of my grandmother's estate and a secret insurance policy. My father had tried to claim it years ago, but failed the ethics check. It was a massive sum intended solely for my daughter's future education and medical needs. He had hidden its existence out of spite. Now, it was legally mine to manage. I felt a surge of triumph that tasted like iron. My daughter was fully protected. We spent the afternoon at a quiet park near our new house. Emma ran through the grass, her laughter clear and bright in the autumn air. She wasn't looking for approval or hiding her device anymore. She was just a little girl discovering the world's music. I realized that my silence hadn't been a weakness after all. It was a reservoir of strength I had saved for this moment. Mark held my hand, and for once, the future felt like a promise. Just as we prepared to leave, a final notification appeared on my screen. The state investigation into my firm was officially closed with no findings of wrongdoing. However, the federal team had uncovered a second offshore account in my sister's name. Rachel had been skimming from our father's laundering operation for 3 years, a secret she had hidden even while begging me for tuition money. She wasn't just a witness, she was a partner in his crimes. I looked at the sunset and knew the cabin was about to become a prison. The law was finally calling.